Welcome to ILTV's Insider. I'm Steve Leibowitz. The U.S. is apparently planning to roll out a grand plan for the remaking of the Middle East in the aftermath of the war in Gaza. It reportedly includes new Palestinian rule in Gaza and areas of Judea and Samaria, and a timeline for a Palestinian state. They are waiting for, reportedly, is Israel to end the war in Gaza so that the process can begin. Oh, and it includes Israeli normalization with Saudi Arabia. Well, joining us are pollster Mitchell Barak from Kivun Strategies and Dr. Gerald Steinberg, political scientist and head of NGO Monitor. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks, Steve. Good to be here.
Before I even ask a question, I need to say we were all around in the heady days of the start of the Oslo process. It brought Yasser Arafat into the territories and began the peace process that would, in theory, ultimately yield a Palestinian state living side by side within Israel and an end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This U.S. plan would go even potentially further, yielding normalization with the Arab world. But before we begin the discussion, let's hear this comment made this week by Prime Minister Netanyahu before any U.S. plan has even been released.
One thing Israel cannot agree to is an international diktat that would seek to unilaterally recognize a Palestinian state, basically force a Palestinian state on Israel after the horror of October 7th. And you should know that the people of Israel are really united in this.
Maybe not the reception the U.S. was hoping for, but probably expecting. Mitchell, let me just start with you. Back in the day, then Prime Minister Barak made efforts to reach peace with Yasser Arafat. We all remember the images of Barak with Arafat and then President Bill Clinton at Camp David. It did not succeed then. The Palestinians rejected a very generous offer. Will there be something on the table this time that the Palestinians could potentially accept?
Well, I think the United States and the international community is going to make Israel and the Palestinians an offer that we and they can refuse. Because, you know, Prime Minister Netanyahu talks about an international diktat of a Palestinian state, but the fact is the U.S. is really financing this our defense in Gaza. Our defense operations to wipe out the Hamas, is giving us international credit in order to do that, is covering us at the Security Council. And many other countries are also saying, okay, we'll give you a little bit of leeway, but there's got to be a day after for the Palestinians. And I think that's really where we're headed at this point. So it's nice that Netanyahu is not going to accept the international dictate. It's not clear whether he's going to be around or how much longer he's going to be around for when the day after comes, because he doesn't have a plan. And we may be at elections sooner than we think. We don't know. But I think that Israelis are learning very quickly that we don't operate in our own little vacuum here in Israel. And in order to survive, we need international support. We need the support of the United States in terms of international credibility and weapons. The billions and billions of dollars that the United States is giving, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And we're going to find that out very soon.
Well, Gerald, let me ask you this. There are signs that the U.S. plans to recognize this new entity that it envisions as an emerging Palestinian state, in effect. The current situation certainly does not offer Israel security, as we saw on October 7th, and every time before and since when there is a terror attack in Israel or Judea and Samaria. Security-wise, would we be better off or worse off with a demilitarized Palestinian state like the U.S. is calling for?
All right, let's start off, first of all, with the beginning of this program, when you showed Prime Minister Netanyahu talking to the heads of the major American Jewish organizations. I was in the room, and those were his words. But just before that, he said a couple of things. First of all, he thanked President Biden and the American people for the tremendous support. And then he said, there are going to be differences. We are a sovereign people. We're a sovereign nation. We have to decide what's good for us. And therefore, that was the term diktat that he used was maybe a little bit stronger than I would have used, but he made it clear. And it wasn't just Netanyahu. It was backed up by everybody else, by Mr. Gantz, Benny Gantz, in the Security Cabinet, the head of the opposition, by Eisenkot, who was also in this new formulation this post-October 7th government, that's across the board. So Israel needs to decide what's good for Israel. And the other part of the evening was just before Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke, American Ambassador Jack Lew presented the American position. And he said, there has never been any statement, any policy by the United States government on unilateral recognition. We're partners and we're going to work towards a better situation as partners. I think what we're seeing is a lot of hype. There are individuals within the American government and within the people who are in the outer circle, people, or the almost inner circle, like journalists like Tom Friedman, who have their own views, who are amplifying various statements and various desires of some people in the administration. I just don't see the Biden administration, Tony Blinken and others, putting something on the table which is even more unlikely to succeed than the Oslo process, which across the board in Israel is known as an absolute total disaster. So I think we need to be careful. Yes, the government, the Israeli government, needs to have a better idea and make it clear what are we putting on the table. You can't beat something with nothing. I think that's a well-known baseball phrase that needs to be used in Israeli politics as well. So what is the Israeli day after plan? We don't know that. The idea of a demilitarized Palestinian state is great if you're teaching in a classroom, if you're writing a book that nobody reads. But if you want to say, how do you get a demilitarized Palestinian state? Look what's going on in Gaza. It's not a Palestinian state. That's a little strip of land. Miles and miles or kilometers of underground tunnels made from stolen humanitarian aid. And Israelis are being killed on a daily basis to try to destroy as much of that as possible. So saying you're going to have a demilitarized Palestinian state and nobody's, look at Lebanon. That was UN Resolution 1701.
We're going to move on to other parts, but I just wanted to stick with this issue for now. Mitchell, as a political pollster, you see the landscape in Israel. Do you see this government supporting this U.S. initiative, which may or may not actually be released, although Prime Minister Netanyahu certainly seems to be taking preventative steps in order to prevent the idea of this going forward?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu always likes to say what is not going to work and what he doesn't want, but he never really says what he wants. And, you know, as Professor Steinberg said, we don't know what the day after plan is for Gaza because I don't think they've formulated it. I don't think Netanyahu has formulated it. He's always, you know, pushed it off. And that's part of the reason, you know, fighting the Palestinian state and dividing the Palestinians in Gaza and Palestinians in the West Bank was a strategy of his. But when it comes to the Israeli public, I mean, I think the Israeli public will have moved to the right to a certain extent, but I think there are also people that will realize that what we have going on, at least not in Gaza, but in Judea and Samaria, is just not sustainable the way it is. And even when we had support, international support for that, we are losing ground internationally for that. And, you know, the Israeli policy of let's continue to build settlements and, you know, talk about it afterwards or talk about annexation, I think it's not going to work. At the end of the day, there's a big carrot and stick here also, which is, you know, not only is the U.S. financing our very survival to a certain extent, but the concept and the ability to have diplomatic relations with not only Saudi Arabia, but with many other countries, which was talked about even from the time of President Obama, is very, very enticing and in Israel's probably long-term security interest. So I think Israelis are going to have to decide, or whatever the new Israeli leadership is going to have to decide, what do we really want to fight for and what's in the best interest, our long-term interests.
Gerald, let me ask you this. Some are saying that the U.S. is effectively planning to stab Israel in the back with this plan, rewarding the Palestinians with a state as a prize, in effect, for the October 7th rampage. We heard those words out of Netanyahu's mouth. But hasn't the two-state solution long been U.S. policy and one opposed by Hamas?
Experience the power of truth with ILTV News. If you're looking for quality content and captivating visuals, join our news community and become an integral part of our team as we embark on a mission to unveil the real Israel, dismantling the web of lies and misinformation that surround reporting on Israel. By subscribing to ILTV News, you will not only have access to the latest updates, but you will also amplify our message, creating a ripple effect that carries the truth far and wide. Subscribe today and help reshape the narrative. Available on the web, Android, and Apple.
Short answer is yes. I'll give you a longer answer. Yes, the United States, since at least 2004, there was something called the Quartet, and this was after Arafat was boxed off in the Muqata in Ramallah, wasn't able to function by the Israeli military, and the U.S. President George W. Bush said, okay, we're going to have a new Middle East peace plan, and it's going to be two states, or two peoples and all that, and I think also demilitarized and all that. Well, that was 20 years ago. And as you said, not only did Hamas not show any interest, but Palestinian Authority, Fatah, the majority of Palestinians are not interested in a Palestinian state. The majority, I'm doing this, Einat Wolf would have said this very clearly. For 76 years, the Palestinians have said across the board, our goal is destroying Israel. We want to go back to 1948. It's interesting that when Secretary of State Blinken was here, he talked about specifically the need to have political reform in the Palestinian Authority. That's a very, very weak statement of what really needs to be done, but it's there on the map. That's a precondition. Well, they haven't had any reform ever. And it's very unlikely there's no path that we can see. It's going to take a generation or two for, even in the best of circumstances, to have enough Palestinians who are going to say, yes, we want to have a two-state solution living side by side in peace with Israel. Two states that are not living side by side in peace is worse than the situation we have now. Every Israeli knows it. And I think that Secretary of State Blinken also has some idea of the Israeli position on that. President Biden also has said that in the past, the need to have Palestinians. The issue is not Israeli settlements. The issue is not what Israel does. The issue is nothing has changed on the Palestinian side since 1948. And there is not nearly enough thought as to how to make that change. It actually links to UNRWA. UNRWA has been, the United Nations Relief Works Agency, has been the main source of reinforcing Palestinian, what they call the myth of return. Einat Wolf calls it West-splaining, a bunch of Westerners explaining Palestinians, not by what they say, but what the West thinks they're going to say. But Palestinians will all tell you, we want to go back to the situation before 1948. No Jews, no Jewish state. Well, that's not even close to a starting position. So there's a long way to go before we get to those details.
All right, Mitchell, let me ask you this. If the U.S. does present this plan and it's Israel that comes out and says no, in practical terms, if they move ahead toward recognizing an emerging Palestinian entity, can Israel even afford to say no? And without Israeli cooperation, what would that plan even look like?
Well, the good thing about Netanyahu is Netanyahu always knows that the sun will rise again tomorrow, and tomorrow may give him new opportunities. And he knows that in the United States, in November, the sun is going to rise again. And there could be a new president, there could be a new Congress, there could be a lot of different things. So I think, some of this is being driven. The urgency that's being driven is also what people in America are seeing on their television screens in Gaza, which, looks terrible if you don't understand what Israel is fighting against and you don't understand, the threat to Israelis, then you might not fully understand why Israel is doing that. So there's been a lot of blowback to President Biden for supporting this and to the Congress for aiding it. So some of this now he's got to win back parts of the Democratic Party between now and, the summer, and then into the election. So some of this is just going to be, nothing is going to happen really within a 6-month window that's going to really be earth shattering. But there does have to be some movement from the U.S. side showing more, let's say, of an even-handedness or more support for Palestinians in the long term, as the U.S. has given Israel total backing. And Israel is also going to have to make fundamental changes to understand what can Israel do more to give Palestinians, more autonomy, more rights, more movement, whatever it is. But yes, Professor Steinberg is correct. A lot of them are looking for, return to 48. That's not going to happen. So how are we going to do that? And by the way, many of the international leaders and many of the people that are saying Israel is going to have to recognize a Palestinian state, they don't complete the sentence by saying, and Palestinians are going to have to recognize Israel's right to exist. And I think that's part of the problem. That's part of our problem explaining it to it, to people, which is we should say that we might recognize a Palestinian state, but they've got to have to recognize our right to be here. And that's a problem at this point.
Well, Gerald, I want to go beyond the Palestinian aspects of the U.S. plan. It reportedly includes an agreement for the northern border, normalization between Israel and the Saudis, and potentially a U.S.-led defense agreement for the region to counter Iran. Would you see at least bipartisan support for this in Congress? And how strong would support be for such an agreement here in Israel if it includes the element of the Palestinian state in it?
Lots of pieces in this puzzle, and I really think it's a big stretch to imagine how they go together. But let's start with the Saudis. That's a big prize. You know, you and I, Mitchell, we're all old enough to remember the Saudi ambassador getting up in the UN and giving the most virulent anti-Semitic speeches about the Jews. And of course, you couldn't go into Saudi Arabia if you had any kind of Jewish symbol, or if you were, you had to write your religion down. There's all those other things. There's certainly no connection to Israel. But things have changed. The Saudi leadership now is pragmatic. It understands that in order to reach a level of economic development after the oil age is over, in order to get their society to be one that is going to be able to function in the 21st, 22nd century, they have to go and develop broader contacts. And Israel is a very important part of that. It's what the UAE and Bahrain did a couple of years ago, it was 5 or 6 years ago, during the Trump administration. That was one of the huge achievements of that administration. And the Saudis are in the same ballgame, but they are more, so they're slower because they want to see more movement on the Palestinian issue. And that connects the pieces together. And I don't know how you're going to do all those connections. There may be a minimum formula of declarations, not necessarily implemented over the next few years, that will bring the Saudis into this framework. It's based on interests. It's not based on theology, ideology, hugging each other and saying, let's bring peace. It's exactly the same perspective that brought Begin and Sadat together. Israeli and Egyptian interests back in 1977, 8, and 9 were fundamentally focused on working together. It's worked quite well, even though there's some friction right now, but that's still a lot of cooperation. That's what we need in the region, including, of course, the threat from Iran. And the stronger that Israel is, the more Israel will be able to assist in countering the threat from Iran that exists for all the Sunni Arab states in the Gulf. The biggest problem in this is the question of the Palestinians and how that fits into this and all the issues that we've talked about before. And how do you basically square that circle of not having a viable formula for a Palestinian state, and at the same time wanting to see some movement on the other fronts? I don't see any kind of bipartisan anything in U.S. politics, and maybe I'm exaggerating. I'm looking at it from Israel, but some of my best friends and family are Americans, so this is what I see and hear. That bipartisanship in the United States on foreign policy is almost a thing of the past. Look, there's this bill to provide urgent military aid to Ukraine and to Israel that's being held up over the debate between the Republicans and the Democrats, the fight over American immigration. And we are at the mercy of that divide that exists in the United States. I wouldn't build on any scenario in terms of American politics. Everything's up in the air, and it could be a bigger and bigger mess. And that goes back to one of the points that Mitchell talked about. Israel needs to be far more independent.
I want to go back to Mitchell one more time before we run out of time. Mitchell, recent polls have shown a dramatic decline in support, certainly, for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his coalition. But they have not shown any growth at all on the left and even the center left. 4 seats for Meretz, 0 for Labor, and 12 for Lapid. Where are the voices to support the U.S. push for peace going to come from?
They're going to have to come. I mean, I think that the major parties are going to have to realize that, there has to be a movement there. First of all, it's way too early to write Prime Minister Netanyahu's political obituary. He's going to be, he's holding on. He may not be popular now, but at the end of the day, all of the people that would be running against him right now within the Knesset, many of them served in government or spent their lives in the army. So, I don't know that, that will be the major issue. And again, Netanyahu will be running unopposed, meaning it will be Netanyahu, the strongest leader, versus a consortium of everyone else together and people who want to, switch being prime minister every 2 years or every 6 months. And Israelis really don't like that. They like to see leadership. So I don't know if real leadership, solid leadership, is going to emerge from this. If it does, it might change things. But I think we need, if Israelis have more pragmatic leaders within the existing parties, they're going to realize that something has to be done. Now, taking a little bit of what Professor Steinberg said, talking about the Israel-Egyptian peace treaty, that is a pretty solid treaty. Both Egypt and Jordan, have not joined in and have not canceled their peace treaties, and that is significant. And it's also significant that the peace treaties happened with Egypt only a few years after the 1973 war. So, as horrible as things were after 73, a few years later, Israel was able to make peace with the Egyptians. So I think a lot can happen here, but I think Israelis, we're still in
Mitchell.
this incident. We're still in the shock and the period of mourning. It's too early to tell, and I wouldn't listen to any polls at this point because it's not indicative of anything. We're not in an election. We're in a war. People are behind the war, and they may like some personalities who are in the cabinet more than others. It's totally irrelevant right now.
Gerald, I'm sorry, we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask you quickly. Imagine for a moment, if you could, the reaction in the settlements and illegal outposts when they see a map of the emerging Palestinian state. How do you see that going?
I don't see that going. I don't see we're going to get to that stage, partly because of what Mitchell said. We're still in the middle of a war. One of the things that we learned, I hope, for the last 5-10 years of gridlock until the terrible events of October 7th, is we have to work for common ground. The people who live in the area of the post-67 lines, Judea and Samaria, across the Green Line, are Israelis. They cannot be wiped off the map. They have to be brought into the discussion. And presenting a map as a fait accompli is not going to happen. It's going to be much more complicated. It's going to have to be worked out piece by piece.
All right, well, thank you
Peace.
both. Sorry.
Peace by peace for peace, right?
Peace for peace. Unfortunately, that's
By peace.
all. Raz is telling me that's all the time we have today. Thank you so much for being with us this evening, to our guests, Mitchell Barak from Kivun Strategies and Dr. Gerald Steinberg. And thank you to our loyal viewers. For more of the latest updates from Israel, make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at iltv.tv. Thanks for watching. Let's win the war and bring them home.